The water comes in before you hear it. That is the detail no one talks about. Not the surge, not the breach, the silence that comes first. A low gurgle at the base of the door frame, the kind of sound a house makes when it settles, and then the color. Brown, the specific brown of Texas hill country clay mixed with 3 days of rain and everything that lived beside the Guadalupe River. It moves flat and patient across the floor like it belongs there. Kerr County, Saturday, July 5th, 2025. Somewhere around 2:47 in the morning. There's a house. There's a door. There's a gap at the bottom of that door, maybe an inch, maybe less, and through that gap, water the color of old mud is rising. Not pouring, rising, steadily, without negotiation. By the time anyone inside that house could smell it, the cold mineral smell of river water carrying soil and bark and something older than the county itself, the floor was already gone. That image is where this begins. Not because it is the worst image from that night. It is not even close, but because it is the kind of image that lodges, the kind that your mind replays later in a quiet moment, in a room where you are perfectly safe and still something in your chest responds as if you are not. You have seen images like this before. The footage from the Texas floods of 2025 has been running on televisions and phone screens across this country since that Saturday. Aerial shots of Kerrville neighborhoods submerged to the roof lines. Cars stacked against bridge pylons, scattered and weightless. The Guadalupe at a level nobody alive in that county had measured before. Some reports putting the crest above 60 feet in certain stretches, more than double what residents there called a bad flood. At least 24 confirmed dead in that first reporting window. Search and rescue teams working in water, still too fast for boats in some areas. Communities that had built their lives around that river, now watching it erase the geography they knew. This is not a small event dressed up in dramatic language. This is Kerr County, Texas, in the opening days of July 2025, and the numbers are real, the mud is real, the families sorting through what is left are real. And across the country, roughly the same week, the sky over the Northeast turned that particular shade of amber that people in Boston and Philadelphia and New York are beginning to recognize. Canadian wildfire smoke drifting south again. The air quality alerts again. The AQI numbers climbing into ranges that tell people over a certain age with certain histories to stay inside. Again, 2 events. 2 different kinds of catastrophe, one violent and immediate, one slow and atmospheric, and both landing in the same nervous system, yours, through the same screen, through the same daily intake of news that has been, for most of us, the background noise of recent years. Not the floods, not the smoke. Those are reported. Those are real. We will stay with them, because they deserve that. Not the summary version, the actual weight of what happened. But underneath the event, there's a question that almost no one is asking. What happens inside the body of a person who watches images of disaster? Not once, not in a crisis, but repeatedly across months, across years as a normal condition of being informed. And what does that accumulated exposure do to the biology of someone who is, let's say, somewhere in the second half of their life? Because something is happening in the body of the person watching. Something measurable. Something that compounds quietly, the way river water moves through a gap you didn't think to seal. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily until the floor is gone and you're only beginning to understand what you're standing in. That is what this is. The event on the Guadalupe, the smoke over the Northeast, and what has been accumulating without a name inside you. There's a specific kind of tired that most people over 45 carry without ever being able to explain it to a doctor, a partner, or even to themselves. It is not the tired that sleep fixes. It is not the tired that a vacation repairs. It is something older, something that has been building layer by layer, the way sediment builds at the bottom of a river, quiet, invisible, accumulating with each current that passes through. And here is what this chapter is about. For the first time, that exhaustion has a clinical name. The University of Chicago Traumatic Stress Research Consortium published findings that put language to something millions of Americans above 45 have been living inside without knowing what to call it. They named it vicarious disaster exposure fatigue. And the definition is precise enough to feel like a mirror held up against the inside of your chest. It is not depression. Depression changes the color of everything. It makes mornings gray and futures uncertain and the present moment feel distant, like you are watching your own life through frosted glass. Vicarious disaster exposure fatigue is not that. You can still laugh. You can still function. You can still love your work and your people and your routines. It is not clinical anxiety either. Anxiety is anticipatory, the mind running forward into a future that has not arrived, racing through worst-case scenarios, building catastrophes out of possibilities. What the University of Chicago team described is different in structure. It is not about the future. It is about the continuous present. It is the state of a nervous system that has been asked again and again to process events it has no direct power to affect. The smoke coming down from the north over Philadelphia and Hartford this week. The images from the Texas coast. The weather alerts. The flooding. The displacement. The footage that loops on every screen. You're not there. You're not the one whose roof is gone, whose neighborhood is underwater, whose lungs are breathing that particulate thick air. But your body does not entirely believe that. You keep the windows closed against air that should not be breathed, and the smell still finds a way in, something between burnt paper and dry earth, and the body has already formed an opinion about it before the mind is finished reading the headline. This is what the Chicago research isolates with unusual precision. Adults over 45 process catastrophic news events differently than younger adults. Not because they're less resilient, but because they're more experienced. The brain at 45 has a larger emotional archive. It has watched more cycles of disaster and recovery, crisis and consequence. And that very depth, the thing that is supposed to be wisdom, becomes the mechanism through which vicarious disaster exposure fatigue takes hold. Because the brain, when it encounters a new crisis, does not start fresh. It cross-references. It reaches back. It stacks this disaster on top of the memory of the last one. What the body registers is not a single event. It registers a pattern, and patterns, unlike events, have no clear ending. The consortium's data focus specifically on adults 45 and above across 3 major metropolitan regions during periods of overlapping environmental and geopolitical crises. What they found was not a spike in depression diagnoses or anxiety disorders. What they found was something more diffuse and, in some ways, more difficult to treat because it did not present as a clinical emergency. It presented as a pervasive readiness, a low but constant state of physiological alertness that had quietly become the background condition of daily life. The body was not in crisis. The body was in preparation for crisis, continuously, indefinitely. They called it a state of permanent readiness posture. Heart rate not elevated, but never fully at rest. Breath not short, but never fully deep. Jaw not clenched, but never fully released. Sleep arriving, but never fully landing. The body reshaped across months and years to accommodate a world that manufactures emergencies in series, one handing off to the next without pause, without the space that used to exist between crises when the body could remember what it felt like to be off duty. Here is why the name matters. Not as a diagnosis to carry, not as a label to present to a physician, but because something happens in the human nervous system when it finally encounters a precise description of what it has been enduring. There is a specific physiological shift, documented in trauma literature, that occurs when the brain moves from the wordless experience of a state to the named understanding of it. Language creates structure. Structure creates distance. Distance creates, for the first time, the possibility of a different relationship with the experience. You are not falling apart. You are doing something extraordinarily taxing that nobody around you could see, that the culture around you had no vocabulary for, that your own inner voice could not articulate except as a vague, persistent wrongness. The Texas flooding is real. The smoke over New England is real. And the weight that settled in your chest when you watched it, that weight is real too. Not a weakness, not a sensitivity to be managed or minimized. A response, a physiologically coherent response to a volume of input that no previous generation in history absorbed at this pace, at this scale, with this combination of immediacy and helplessness. The Traumatic Stress Research Consortium gave it a name. Write it down if you need to. Let it replace the unnamed thing that has been occupying that space. Now here is where the chapter turns, and this is the turn that actually matters. Because the moment a state becomes named and measurable, something else becomes possible. The same research that identified this pattern also found that the nervous system does not hold a permanent readiness posture without chemical consequence. Cortisol, inflammatory markers, telomere compression in adults who reported sustained news-related distress over 18 months or longer. The body keeps score in biology, which means the path back is also biological. And it begins not with news avoidance or meditation retreats, but with understanding what frequency your nervous system has been locked onto and learning deliberately to change the signal. That is not a metaphor. The law of vibration is not a motivational slogan. It is a description of a physiological state, and physiological states can be shifted. That is where this goes next. There's a particular quality to northeastern summer air that you carry in your nose even after the window is closed. Something between cut wood and copper, faintly metallic at the back of the throat. If you lived anywhere between Maine and Maryland during the weeks the smoke moved in off the Canadian fires, or during the Western Drift events this past year, you know what I mean. It doesn't announce itself the way a storm does. It settles, patient, invisible, like it has nowhere else to be. That quality, that settled, patient invisibility is the first thing you need to understand about PM 2.5. Particulate matter measuring 2.5 micrometers or smaller. To give that scale any meaning, a single human hair is roughly 70 micrometers wide. PM 2.5 particles are so fine they bypass the mechanical defenses of the upper airway entirely. The cilia, the mucus, the architecture of the nose and throat that evolved to catch larger particles. These particles go straight in. They reach the alveoli, the deep lung tissue, the gas exchange membrane. And from there, they cross. Not stay. Cross. They enter the bloodstream. And once inside the blood, they trigger a cascade that researchers at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health have been documenting with a precision that is difficult to look away from. The specific study worth understanding here looked at inflammatory biomarkers in adults across different age cohorts following smoke exposure events. What they found wasn't that older adults got sicker in the ways we typically measure sick. More hospitalizations, more respiratory events. It was more fundamental than that. Adults 45 and older mounted a systemic inflammatory response to PM 2.5 exposure that was measurably, significantly more intense than the response seen in younger adults. And the marker they were tracking, C-reactive protein, the liver's signal flare for inflammation anywhere in the body, remained elevated for up to 72 hours post-exposure. 3 days, not 3 hours. 3 days of the body holding its defensive posture, muscles slightly braced, cellular resources redirected, the immune system burning through reserves it would have otherwise spent on maintenance and repair. This is the biological cost of breathing smoke, and it is real, and it is documented, and it is specific to the body over 45 in a way that younger adults simply do not experience at the same magnitude. And then the Columbia researchers did something the air quality index updates and the purple weather app icons never bothered to do. They looked at what happened inside. Not outside during the events. Inside, adults who saw the alerts closed their windows, ran the HEPA filter, kept the kids off the porch. Adults who, by every reasonable measure, did what they were supposed to do. Their C-reactive protein still spiked. Sit with that for a moment, not to catastrophize it, but to let it actually land. The smoke came through the walls. Not enough to register on an indoor air monitor. Not enough to smell, not at full concentration, but enough, in combination with something else the researchers were tracking, that the body registered threat and responded accordingly. The something else was the neuroimmune pathway, the mechanism through which perceived danger, the cognitive and emotional processing of a threat, activates the same inflammatory cascade as direct physical exposure. The brain does not always distinguish cleanly between the emergency it is watching on a screen and the emergency it is standing inside. When the images are vivid, when the danger is real and ongoing, when the person watching has a prior relationship with that geography or those communities or that particular kind of loss, the body responds. Not as a figure of speech, biochemically. In Chapter 1, we named something and left it half opened. The fatigue that settles into a person not because they were out there in the smoke, not because they felt the heat, but simply because they watched. We called it vicarious exposure fatigue and said the full explanation required a foundation. This is the foundation. The fatigue has a biological address, a measurable one, the kind that shows up on a blood panel. That isn't a reframing of a feeling. That changes what we're talking about entirely. This isn't new science at its root. Decades of research on trauma and immunological response, much of it built on work with veterans and first responders, established that the body's threat detection system does not require physical contact with the danger. What is newer and more specific is the application to the kind of ambient, low-grade, chronic exposure that defines the news cycle now. The rolling emergency, the always another event. The way smoke from Canadian forests can hang over the Manhattan skyline and fill 40 million living rooms simultaneously. And those 40 million people can each process, neurologically, some fraction of the alarm their biology was built to process only when the smoke was directly overhead. The body is doing what it was built to do. That is not a malfunction. It's a system so well designed it kept working even when the context outran it by 100,000 years. The threat detection architecture was calibrated for a world where the danger you watched through your window was the danger you were physically inside. The collapse of geographic distance in a modern media environment, where the disaster in one region lands in real time on every screen in every other region, happened too fast for biology to notice, let alone adjust. So the body reacts. And in the body over 45, it reacts harder and it holds longer. The 72-hour window matters because of what is moving through it beyond inflammation. When CRP runs elevated systemically for that duration, it doesn't sit quietly. It disrupts sleep architecture, specifically slow-wave sleep, the phase where the brain clears metabolic waste, consolidates memory, and where growth hormone release peaks. In people over 45, that phase is already more fragile than it was 20 years earlier. The architecture thins naturally with age. So when the inflammatory load presses on it, there's less margin, and the compensatory mechanisms that help a younger brain recover from a disrupted night are less available. The smoke doesn't just inflame the lungs. Through the inflammatory pathway, it taxes the brain's overnight maintenance window. And if the exposure is chronic, not one smoke event, but a season of them, each one cycling through the news feed, each one tripping the same alarm, the disruption accumulates. A 2021 paper out of the University of Washington's Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences tracked cognitive performance in adults 50 and older during and after prolonged smoke exposure periods in the Pacific Northwest. The declines were not catastrophic. They were subtle. Processing speed, working memory, sustained attention. The kind of subtle that doesn't feel like a health event. It feels like an off week. It feels like not quite being yourself. The ambient dullness of it, the slight lag, the sense that something is costing more than it should and you can't locate the source. That combination, invisible in origin, imprecise in symptom, is exactly what makes it easy to miss and hard to correct. Here is what that adds up to in the body. A person over 45 carrying an elevated inflammatory baseline, even a modest one, even one triggered by watching rather than breathing, by the alarm rather than the ash, is a person whose regulatory systems are working against a floor that's already raised. The autonomic nervous system's capacity to move between activation and rest is compressed. The HPA axis's rhythm of arousal and recovery runs shallower. Every signal that comes and arrives in a system that was already mid-brace. Think about what that means for the next input. the next air quality alert, the next image of a smoke-red skyline or a neighborhood underwater. It doesn't land in a neutral body. It lands in a body that was already leaning forward. And because the body was already leaning, it over-responds. The CRP climbs a fraction higher. The sleep breaks a little earlier. The baseline rises another notch. Not dramatically, just persistently. The way the copper smell persists, even after the window has been shut, even after the air monitor reads clean, something in the walls still holding it. That is the cycle, not a metaphor for a cycle. The actual cycle running in tissue and chemistry. What interrupts it isn't ignorance of the news, not avoidance, not the comfortable fiction that if you don't watch, you won't be affected. Because the Columbia data makes clear the smoke finds you regardless. What interrupts it is something more demanding than closing the window, the deliberate act of changing the state from which you receive the next signal. Not controlling what arrives, changing how you are standing when it does. That is the work. It is harder than most interventions people reach for, and the data suggests it is more effective. Because if the body reacts to the smoke it cannot see, to the disaster it watches from 1,000 miles away, and the evidence is that it does, then there is a further question. One that the biology of anticipation makes urgent, and one for which there is now a specific, uncomfortable body of research. If the body responds to the threat, it is watching. What does it do with the threat it is only expecting? The disaster that hasn't arrived yet, but that the forecast says is coming, that the memory says is possible, that the body has already begun, quietly, in the dark of the chest, to prepare for? The answer to that question reaches deeper into the body than smoke does, and it changes the picture considerably. The answer was there in the data before anyone wanted to say it plainly. Not in the aftermath, not in the wreckage left by the storm, or in the hospital beds filled after the smoke settled over Philadelphia and Providence and a stretch of coastline between them. The answer was in the waiting, in the weeks before and the weeks after, when nothing was actively happening to you, but your body had already decided something was. Dr. Sonia Lupian has spent more than 2 decades at the Center for Studies on Human Stress in Montreal, watching what happens to people who live in a state of environmental anticipation. The lab itself is unremarkable. Fluorescent light, the low hum of equipment, the particular institutional smell of a building that never fully warms up, even in summer. But the work done inside it is in the quiet way that certain scientific findings are deeply uncomfortable. What she found was this: the inflammatory markers in adults who maintained what her team called chronic environmental hypervigilance, a sustained, low-grade alertness to potential catastrophe, were elevated in ways that were statistically indistinguishable from people who had experienced the actual event. In some cases, the anticipatory group showed higher sustained elevation. The body preparing for the disaster was, in measurable biological terms, taking more damage than many bodies that went through it. Hold that. Don't move past it. The fear of the flood did more to certain bodies than the flood itself. Now, think about the last 6 weeks. The footage out of Texas, flat brown earth, the sky turned the color of a bruise at noon. The sound on those videos, almost nothing, just wind and the occasional vehicle moving through air so thick it looked textured. The warnings stacked on top of warnings. The air quality maps spreading across the Northeast like something spilled from jar. Orange, then red, Then the deep burgundy that means stay inside, seal the windows, don't run, don't exert yourself, don't breathe deeply. And then the next morning, the forecast. And the morning after that, you are not in the path of the storm. You are not standing in a field in Lubbock watching a wall of dust the color of rust move toward you at 40 miles an hour. The smoke is not in your street, but something in you has been holding a posture, a slight internal brace, a kind of attentive tension in the upper chest for longer than you can remember when it started. That posture has a name. Lupien's team called it hypervigilance. What it means at the level of tissue and blood and the invisible traffic of the immune system is that your body has been running a low-grade emergency protocol. Not because you told it to, because nervous systems shaped by millions of years of environmental threat do exactly this when the environment, as reported through news and conversation and the satellite maps on every phone screen, signals that danger is nearby and indefinite. The mechanism is the sustained activation of threat detection pathways designed for acute, resolvable danger. A predator, a fire, a flood that either takes you or passes. The system was built for events with endings. It was not built for the particular modern condition of being accurately and continuously informed about every potential catastrophe within the broadcast radius of a civilization. There's an older piece of research, different lab, different decade, that found something structurally similar in populations living near nuclear facilities. Not people who had experienced an incident, people who lived close enough to know one was possible. Their interleukin-6 levels, their C-reactive protein, their fibrinogen, the quiet numerical grammar of systemic inflammation, ran consistently higher than matched populations living farther away. Those towns were ordinary towns. Grocery stores, schoolyards, the smell of cut grass on Saturday mornings, nothing visibly wrong. The facility never malfunctioned. The disaster never came. The body never got the signal that it was safe to stand down. That research is from a different era and a different threat, but the biology is the same biology. And the biology does not distinguish between nuclear facilities and smoke forecasts and catastrophic storm systems moving across states where people live. This is the part of the conversation that tends to get skipped. The coverage of extreme weather events focuses reasonably, necessarily, on the people in the direct path. The emergency rooms, the displacement, the structural damage. What does not get covered is the diffuse, distributed biological cost absorbed by the millions of people watching from a distance, day after day, in a state of attentive, informed, well-meaning dread. There is a particular quality to the light in late afternoon when the sky has that haze, not fully overcast, not clear, just muted like someone turned the contrast down. You have seen that light recently, maybe through a window at work, the glass cool against your hand, or through the windshield driving home, and you notice something in your chest respond to it before your mind had a chance to name what it was responding to. That response, instantaneous, involuntary, happening below the threshold of conscious thought, is the threat detection system doing its job. The problem is that it keeps doing its job. Long after the afternoon passes, long after the forecast changes. Here is where the inversion sits. The one that Lupien's work implies without quite stating it as bluntly as it deserves. The danger is not only out there. Some of it has taken up residence in here, in the anticipation itself, in the vigilance, in a sustained biological readiness for a catastrophe that may or may not arrive. The disaster, when it comes, has a shape and a duration. The waiting is shapeless, and the shapeless thing, it turns out, is harder on the body. This does not mean the news is wrong. It does not mean the events are not serious. They are, and this video has not looked away from them. It means that how you are receiving the information is itself a physiological event, not a metaphor. A measurable biological condition that has been running quietly like a background process for most people watching this. That last sentence is where the law of vibration stops being abstract. What you're tuned to, you amplify. A nervous system locked in anticipatory threat is not neutral receiving equipment. It is actively selecting for confirmation, filtering toward danger, keeping the signal alive because that is what the tuning demands. You are not passively watching the forecast. You are, at the cellular level, participating in it. The question Lupien's research forces is not whether this is happening. It is whether you are willing to become a more deliberate receiver, not by denying the reality of what is out there, but by recognizing that the quality of your attention is a physical choice with physical consequences. The storms are real. The smoke is real. And the man who understands the mechanism of his own vigilance does not stop watching. He watches differently. He stands in it without being consumed by it. That capacity is not a personality trait. It is a trainable condition. And it begins, as most things begin, with knowing what is actually happening inside you while it happens. The smell reached the body before it reached the mind. Something dry and faintly sweet. The particular quality of air that arrives when wildfire smoke has been traveling east for 2 days and finally finds the seals around a closed window inadequate. The olfactory system has a direct line to the amygdala, faster than language, faster than the word smoke forming in the throat. The body had already shifted its posture before any conscious accounting took place. That is where this starts, not with a decision to be afraid, but with a body that made the assessment first and left the mind to catch up. There is a number worth knowing. Researchers at the University of Pittsburgh Sleep Research Institute tracked adults between 45 and 72 through 3 years of elevated environmental stress. Not war, not clinical trauma, but the ambient kind. The kind that moves through a phone screen and a car radio and the quality of late summer air when the wind is wrong. What they found after 3 years was a 41% average reduction in slow-wave sleep in that population. Stage 3 and Stage 4 combined. Gone. And the body has no substitute mechanism, no workaround, no other hour or state in which it can recover what those phases provide. Slow-wave sleep is when the glymphatic system opens. The brain clears its metabolic waste through a drainage network that runs along blood vessels and flushes debris into the cerebrospinal fluid. Proteins that accumulate with age, cellular residue from a day of processing everything the world sends at you. In a body whose slow-wave sleep is intact, the brain wakes carrying less than it carried the night before. Not pristine, not restored to some idealized baseline, but lighter, in a body whose sleep has been fractured by a nervous system that learned, across months, to maintain low-grade operational readiness even in the dark. That clearance slows. The debris accumulates faster than it is removed. And this is not a vague sense of mental heaviness. It is a biological process that is either occurring or being interrupted night after night, in a system that cannot tell the difference between a threat it can act on and a threat it can only witness. The smoke smell is still there, even with the windows sealed, still finding its way through, faint and dry, like something that burned 2 states away and decided to arrive here anyway. The body has already incorporated it, filed it, adjusted the baseline without asking for input. The Pittsburgh data identified 2 other systems eroding alongside sleep in the same cohort. The first is innate immune function, not the adaptive branch, not antibodies or memory cells, but the older, faster branch that responds to immediate threat without needing to identify a specific pathogen. What shifted in the study population was not cell count, but functional readiness. The speed and precision of activation when a genuine threat appeared. Chronic alert states appear to produce a kind of exhaustion in that branch. The cells are present. The response is slower, less exact. The second system is heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat fluctuation that indicates how fluidly the autonomic nervous system moves between activation and recovery. High variability means the system is adaptive, capable of shifting gears. Low variability means it is locked in one. In the Pittsburgh cohort, that number dropped 18% across the study period. 18% of the nervous system's flexibility eroded by sustained exposure to a world that never quite settled back into safety. None of these 3 systems fail loudly. They degrade in the background across weeks and months, while the person whose body is changing continues to go to work, continues to read the news, continues to notice a low friction in everything, a slightly increased effort required for things that used to feel automatic, without being able to name what shifted or when. The researchers called it allostatic load escalation. Allostatic load being the cumulative biological cost of chronic stress, and escalation meaning the cost does not stay flat. It compounds. Fragmented slow-wave sleep impairs the immune system's overnight restoration cycle. A compromised innate immune response generates low-level inflammatory signaling that further disrupts sleep architecture. Reduced heart rate variability means the body arrives at each new day already carrying the residue of the last, recovering more slowly from each activation before the next one arrives. The loop closes. In adults over 45, whose physiological reserve is already narrower than it was at 30, it closes faster and tightens more completely. Outside, somewhere 2 states west, something is still burning. The smell keeps arriving. What the Pittsburgh data does not address, what most of the research on chronic stress exposure does not address, is what comes next. There are obvious moves. Stop reading the news. Stop checking the air quality index. Decide that what drifts east from a Canadian wildfire is not your problem. But that is not the nervous system coming down from a state. That is suppression, and suppression carries its own biological cost because the signal is already in the body. The olfactory system already sent its message to the amygdala. The immune system already adjusted its readiness. Looking away does not undo what has already been logged. So if disengagement is not the answer, and if continued exposure, the same frequency continues eroding the 3 systems the data identified, then the question sharpens into something more specific than stress management. The nervous system is a tunable instrument. This is what the research on heart rate variability, on vagal tone, on resonance frequency breathing has been demonstrating for 20 years. The body is not simply a passive receiver of environmental signal. It has mechanisms for broadcasting a different frequency inward, for shifting the autonomic balance deliberately, for interrupting the feedback loop before it tightens another increment. Practices built around slow, rhythmic respiration at specific rates, typically around 5 to 6 breath cycles per minute, consistently increase heart rate variability in clinical studies, not as a workaround, as a direct input to the system that is losing flexibility. This is where the law of vibration stops being a philosophy and starts being a physiology. What you are vibrating at, measured in autonomic tone, in sleep architecture, in immune readiness, can be changed by deliberate, sustained practice. Not changed overnight. Not changed by a single session of controlled breathing or a week of better sleep hygiene, but changed. The Pittsburgh cohort deteriorated over months. Recovery also moves across months. The direction, though, is not fixed. The loop can run the other way. The smell is still in the room. The body already knows it. The question now is what the body does next, and whether that is something you have any say in. Two people are standing in the same room, watching the same footage on the same screen. The same aerial shot of Kerrville, Texas, streets submerged to the roof lines, a child's bicycle half visible through brown water, the remains of what was probably someone's porch spinning slowly in a current that has no business being there. The same anchor's voice, the same timestamp, the same catastrophe. One of them will walk away from that screen in 40 minutes and cook dinner. Their hands will be steady on the knife. They will taste the food. The other will not taste anything for 3 days. This is not a story about sensitivity. It is not a story about emotional strength or discipline, or who has lived through harder things. The two people watching that footage are not divided by how much they feel. They're divided by something that runs below feeling, below intention, below the choices we like to believe we are making in real time. Something biological, something that, once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee. The distinction is not between feeling and not feeling. Let me say that again, because everything else in this chapter rests on it. The person who walks away and cooks dinner, they felt it too. They felt the weight of those flooded streets. Something moved through them when they saw the bicycle. They're not numb. They're not detached in the way that word usually implies. The flat, practiced removal of someone who has decided not to let things in. Something moved through them, and then it moved through. That is the whole of the distinction. Not whether the signal landed, whether the system recovered after it did. The autonomic nervous system, the branch of your biology that operates beneath conscious thought, below willpower, below whatever story you're telling yourself about how you are handling things, runs and ranges. Not switches, not on and off, ranges of activation and return, and the distance between those two people watching the flood footage is not in the initial spike. Both systems spike. The distance is in what happens in the following hours. The arc of return. Whether the arc completes. There is an old piece of equipment used in seismology called a seismograph. It records the ground's movement. The needle swings hard during an earthquake, traces a violent line, and then, when the shaking stops, returns to center. It does not prevent the earthquake. It does not deny it happened. The record of the event is there in the paper. But the needle comes back. A seismograph that cannot return to center after the shaking stops, that keeps tracing keeps oscillating, keeps registering aftershocks and ground that has gone still, is no longer measuring the earthquake. It is measuring something that has gone wrong inside itself. Human beings are extraordinarily similar. The footage from Kerr County, the water at the window level of a Whataburger on Main Street, National Guard boats threading between stop signs. That is real information entering a real nervous system. The spike is appropriate. The body is supposed to register a threat signal. That is not a malfunction. That is a functioning animal responding exactly the way evolution built it to respond. The only question that matters here, is what happens in the following 2 hours. In one person, the system begins its return. The parasympathetic branch reasserts. The prefrontal cortex, which had partially gone offline during the acute response, comes back online. The body moves through the event the way water moves through a pipe, pressurized at the entry, distributed, and then released. The morning after, they wake carrying the weight of what they saw. But the instrument itself is intact. The needle is back at center. The afternoon light coming through the kitchen window has a specific quality right now, late and golden, the kind that turns ordinary countertops into something that almost glows. In the other person, the older, more primitive branch of the autonomic system holds the activation, not because they chose to hold it, not because they are weaker or less disciplined or more prone to catastrophe, because somewhere in the accumulated history of their nervous system, a pattern was established. This category of input does not resolve. Signals of this magnitude, images of displaced families, destroyed homes, an implied future of more of the same, have learned, in this particular body, to stay open. The loop does not close. The system continues to run the threat assessment after the television is off, after dinner, during sleep, across the next several days, burning through resources, narrowing the bandwidth, making the light through the kitchen window simply not register. This is the variable that actually matters. Not the spike, everyone spikes. Not the emotional sensitivity, that is not what separates them. It is where the system habitually returns between events, between news cycles, between disasters, in the unremarkable, low-stakes middle of an ordinary afternoon. The place the needle settles when nothing is actively demanding it move. That settling place shapes everything that follows. The quality of attention brought to the next event, which features of the environment register as salient, which possibilities the prefrontal cortex generates, which actions feel available and which feel foreclosed before they are even considered. The person whose instrument has returned to baseline is not less affected by the flood footage. They are differently resourced in the hours and days after it, processing more, seeing more, with the system intact rather than still burning against a threat that is technically past. The person whose system stays open is not broken. That pattern was adaptive once, somewhere for something. The nervous system does not make mistakes without a prior reason. But the cost of it is real, and it accumulates. And it shows up not just in the dramatic moments, the breaking news, the aerial shots, the child's bicycle in the brown water, but in every ordinary moment between them. In whether the light through the window is something you can see at all, which makes the obvious next question whether any of this is changeable. Whether these two people were always going to respond that way, wired that way from the beginning, or shaped that way by decades of accumulated experience in patterns that are now simply who they are. Whether the settling place is fixed, whether the seismograph, once it has lost its calibration, stays lost, or whether the baseline is something that can be shifted, not suppressed, not bypassed through discipline or the right mindset or sufficient motivation. Shifted at the level of the regulatory architecture itself, through something more specific than willpower and more reliable than hope. That question is real, and it deserves a real answer. The answer exists, but it belongs to the next part of this conversation. Hold the question. Let the flood footage be what it is. Let the two people watching it be distinct and real in your mind. And just notice where your own needle tends to settle after the screen goes dark. The question that was left open a few chapters back, whether recalibration was real, measurable, or just a more sophisticated way of telling yourself to calm down. That question has an answer now. And the answer comes from a place most people wouldn't expect. A fire station parking lot in the outer Sunset District of San Francisco. At 6 in the morning, smelling of diesel and wet concrete. The researchers from UCSF weren't looking for what they found. They were studying burnout trajectories in first responders, paramedics, and firefighters who had worked consecutive disaster seasons. The kind of professionals who, by the time a second wildfire hits, have already carried the weight of the first one in their bodies for months. They expected to find a gradient. More exposure, more damage. Longer careers, higher cortisol baselines, faster erosion. That's the obvious hypothesis. That's what the literature predicted. What they found instead was a fork. Two distinct physiological populations inside the same profession. Same exposure, same call volume, same shift structure, same smoke. And yet the cardiovascular data told two different stories. One group's heart rate variability showed activation on every call, every time the tones dropped. The body doing exactly what a body is supposed to do when the stakes are real. But the return to baseline was slow. Sometimes it didn't complete before the next call came. The emotional residue accumulated layer after layer like sediment. They weren't breaking down quickly. They were filling up quietly. From the outside, they looked steady. Inside, the baseline was creeping up across months, across years, in increments too small to feel until they weren't. The second group activated just as sharply. Pupils, pulse, attention, the whole orchestra. But then something happened that the researchers spent considerable time trying to characterize precisely. The return, not suppression, not avoidance. A genuine, measurable return to baseline. Faster than the first group, cleaner, and crucially, repeatable. The same call, 6 months later. The same pattern. Activate, return. Activate, return. That distinction between suppression and return is the one that matters here. Not as a clinical category, but as something you can feel in the chest after a hard news cycle, in the particular heaviness that either lifts by evening or is still sitting there at 2 in the morning when it has no business being that loud. In July of last year, a neighborhood outside Houston went underwater in under 4 hours. Not the slow creep that gives people time to argue about whether to leave. The kind where the car is floating before the decision gets made. The images moved through the news cycle and then through the algorithm and then into living rooms across the country. And the body, any body paying attention, responded the way bodies respond to footage of people losing everything. A pull behind the sternum, a tightening, something that doesn't have a clean name, but that the instruments can read. That response was not weakness. That response was accuracy. The question the UCSF data raises, quietly, with the kind of rigor that makes it harder to dismiss, is what happens after. Whether the activation completes its arc, whether the system returns, or whether it holds. HeartMath Institute has been measuring cardiac coherence for decades, and this conversation has touched on that work before. What the UCSF First Responder Study adds is something more specific. It shows that the return pattern is not a personality trait. It is a learned structural pattern. The first responders in the high return group did not arrive at the fire station already built that way. The longitudinal data tracked them. They developed it across seasons, across repetition, across something the researchers could only describe as a practiced relationship with activation. Think about what that means in the body. The alarm fires. The alarm is appropriate. The alarm is not the problem. What the body then does with the alarm, whether it metabolizes it or stores it, that is the variable. And that variable turns out to be trainable in ways that show up on instruments, not just in how a person describes feeling afterward. A field outside Flagstaff, Arizona, early September. The air has that particular late summer quality in the high desert, still warm, but carrying the first hint of something thinner, a faint edge of pine resin cutting through the heat. A paramedic named Diane, 18 years on the job, sits in the cab of her unit between calls with her eyes open and her hands loose in her lap. She is not doing anything that looks like a protocol, but her heart rate variability monitor, which she agreed to wear for the study, is showing something the researchers would eventually use as an anchor case in their paper. The nervous system is running a rhythm that is organized, not chaotic. She has just come off a structure fire with 2 casualties. The morning is still warm. A hawk is making wide circles above the ridge line, riding something invisible, not working any harder than it needs to. Diane looks like someone who is feeling it. She also looks like someone who has learned, not been told, learned how to let it move through rather than park. The diesel and the wet concrete from that San Francisco parking lot, the pine resin in the Flagstaff air, these aren't incidental details. They're the actual texture of the environment in which the data was collected. 84 first responders tracked over 22 months across 2 wildfire seasons. A modest sample, a clean signal. Activate, return. Activate, store. 2 patterns, structurally different, measurable on instruments that don't care what a person reports feeling. What the UCSF team documented carefully is that the state a person carries into an event is not sealed off from the event itself. The field is already charged before the call comes in, or it isn't. The first responders who were filling up quietly were not bad at their jobs. In many cases, they were the ones who looked most composed on scene. But the baseline was rising. Every new situation arrived into a field already carrying the residue of the last one, and the one before that compressing. The resilient processors were not carrying less. They were returning more completely. And the returning, done enough times, became structural. It became the pattern the nervous system knew how to run. That is not a small distinction. That is the architecture of the thing. And what makes it worth sitting with is that it did not belong only to paramedics and firefighters. The researchers were explicit about this. The same mechanism, the same fork between suppression and return, shows up in anyone exposed to sustained, repeated input that the body registers as threat, which now includes most people who follow the news past the age of 45 with any degree of honesty about what it does to them, what the data suggests. And this is where it stops being a study about first responders and starts being something more immediate, is that the body's relationship with alarm is not fixed. It is a pattern. Patterns can change. The ones who changed it didn't do it through discipline or distance or learning not to care. They did it by going through the activation fully enough times that the return became the familiar part. The diesel smell from that parking lot stays in the mind because that is where the finding actually lives, not in a journal, not in a control condition, but in the body of someone doing a hard job repeatedly and somehow remaining capable of doing again tomorrow. That capacity is not mysterious. It is measurable, and it is available to more people than currently believe it is. There is a moment, and if you have been watching disasters long enough, you will recognize it, when the body makes its decision before the mind has finished reading the sentence. The smoke report comes through. A county map turns red, and somewhere in the chest, something tightens, not dramatically, not like a hand squeezing, but like fabric pulled a half-inch too tight across the sternum. The lungs take a slightly shallower breath. The skin at the back of the neck does something almost imperceptible, a faint coolness, as if a window opened in a room that has no windows. That sequence happened to a lot of people in the summer of 2023, and it happened to a lot of people this past June. The Texas heat dome pushed temperatures in Dallas past 110 degrees for 11 consecutive days. More than 40 people died, most of them elderly, most of them alone, most of them in homes where the power had gone out or the air conditioning had never worked to begin with. The same weeks, smoke from Canadian wildfires pushed the air quality index in New York City above 400, the highest ever recorded there. Children were kept inside. Outdoor workers, construction, delivery, landscaping had no such option. You saw them on the footage, still moving through it, bandanas over their mouths because the rent was still due. The sky over Manhattan turned the color of a dirty orange, and people sent photographs of it to people they loved, which is a thing humans do when the world looks wrong. When they cannot make it make sense, they share the image, as if a second pair of eyes might find something they missed. Those events are the weight this chapter is carrying. Not abstractions, not case studies. People died in rooms that got too hot, and people breathed air that was not safe to breathe because they had no alternative, and both of those things happened in the wealthiest country on earth in the same summer, within 3 weeks of each other. That is the news. Now here is what happens inside the body receiving it. There's a truth about reality that tends to get dismissed because it sounds like the kind of thing printed on a calendar next to a photograph of mountains. The law of vibration holds that everything in existence is in motion. That matter at the level of physics is never still, and that what we experience as solid or fixed is simply energy moving at a frequency too slow to see as movement. The law of attraction follows from it, that the frequency you are generating through the quality of your thought and the condition of your body and the direction of your attention is also a kind of signal, one that tends to draw toward it whatever matches it. Most people hear that and think it means positive thinking. It does not mean positive thinking. It means something considerably more rigorous than that. Because the frequency you're broadcasting when you sit in front of footage of a man carrying a child out of a flooded house and something seizes in your chest, that frequency is not neutral. It is not just information processing. The body is not a passive receiver. It is participating. And what it is participating in those moments of tightening and shallowing and the coolness at the back of the neck, is a construction, not a reaction. A construction. The brain predicts the body state the situation will require and begins building it before you have consciously decided how to feel. The emotion you name is the brain's best guess about what is already happening in your tissues, which means the dread that settled in during the heat dome coverage, the particular quality of it, the weight that did not lift even after the screen went dark, was built from something. Built from memory. Built from every previous disaster the nervous system has ever filed. Step outside for a moment. Literally, if you can. The cedar fence at the back of the yard, if you live somewhere that has one, smells different in late afternoon than it does in the morning. Warmer, slightly resinous. The wood having absorbed 6 hours of sun. Put your hand on it. Feel the grain under the palm. The slight roughness where the weather has raised the fiber. The body you brought out there with you, the one that was sitting in front of the footage, begins without any instruction to do something different. The jaw, which you probably did not know was slightly clenched, releases a fraction. The hands, which were cool because blood had moved away from the periphery, begin to warm. The next breath goes deeper than the one before it. Not because you told it to, but because the prediction model the brain was running has received new information. The diaphragm is moving freely. The oxygen supply has not been cut off. Whatever is happening in Texas, the fence is still here, the light is still afternoon light, and the world has not ended in the time it took to walk to the back door. This is not avoidance. The heat is still real. The 40-plus dead are still dead. The man still carried the child through the floodwater. Nothing about touching the fence makes any of that less true. What it does is interrupt the loop. The law of vibration is not a metaphor for mood. It is a description of what is actually occurring in the body, in the field around the body, in the quality of attention the body is capable of generating when it is not locked inside a full emergency construction. When the breath lengthens, when the jaw releases, when the hands warm, the frequency changes. Not toward indifference, towards something that can hold the weight of what is real without collapsing under it. The law of attraction responds to that shift, not by making the disasters disappear, by making the part of you that might actually be useful to yourself, to the people around you, eventually to the people the disasters happen to, available again. A body in sustained low-level emergency posture is not a body that can act. It is a body that is waiting for a threat it cannot locate to become locatable. The chest stays slightly braced. The jaw stays slightly set. The breathing stays slightly shallow. And this continues for hours or days or years until the nervous system has spent so much of itself on a threat it cannot reach that the capacity for deliberate response has been quietly exhausted. The margin between those two conditions, the emergency construction and the interrupted one, is not large. It is a breath 3 counts longer on the exhale than the inhale. It is a hand on a cedar fence in afternoon light. It is the jaw releasing by a fraction the sternum dropping a half centimeter, the skin at the back of the neck normalizing from its faint coolness to something closer to the temperature of the air. But in that margin is where something like clarity lives. Not certainty, not the ability to fix what happened in Texas or give back the air that was taken from the people still breathing through bandanas. Just enough room to receive what is real without being rebuilt by it in real time. Enough room to let the weight of it land where weight belongs, in the body, where it is honest, without the body converting that weight into a frequency of helplessness and broadcasting it back out into everything you touch. You're still watching. You're still receiving the news. The disaster has not been minimized by a single degree, but the body you're using to receive it has stepped back, barely perceptibly, from the edge. And that is where you have to be standing if any of this is going to be of use to anyone. The researchers didn't find what they expected. That's the thing about disaster recovery studies. The findings that came out of interviews with Katrina survivors and later with families who lost homes to flooding that swept through the Midwest, they didn't confirm the story we tell ourselves about resilience. They complicated it. And complicating it is the honest thing to do here, because you've been watching footage from Texas, rooftops showing above water the color of wet concrete, the skeletal frames of what were houses 2 days ago, a street sign readable only by its top 3 inches. And if you're anything like the people in those studies, you haven't looked away. You've let it in, which means something is happening inside you right now that deserves to be named accurately, not reassured away. The researchers expected to find that the people who recovered best were the ones who minimized. The ones who said it was bad, but we got through it. The ones who moved on quickly, didn't linger, didn't revisit. That's what the conventional model of coping would predict. Tough people shake it off. Hard men don't dwell. That's not what the data said. The individuals who showed the strongest recovery, lower inflammatory markers at 6 months, better sleep, more coherent daily function, were the ones who had felt it fully. Not the ones who minimized, the ones who contained. There's a difference between those two things that matters more than almost anything else in this chapter. Minimizing is a dam. You build it fast, you build it high, and for a while nothing gets through. But pressure accumulates on the wrong side of the wall, and dams fail. 6 months after the flood, the people who said they were fine the week after were the ones still waking at odd hours, still flinching at heavy rain hitting a roof, still carrying something unprocessed in the jaw and the upper back. The tension didn't leave. It just went quiet. Containing is different. Containing is a riverbank. The water moves through. You feel the current, but you know where the bank is. You know the river has edges. You know the water is passing. What the researchers identified, and this came from direct survivor testimony, not from theory, was that the people who recovered had developed, consciously or not, a kind of temporal frame around the experience. They had felt the event as something that happened. Past tense, not ongoing tense. Not minimized, not suppressed, but placed. It happened there. I was in it. I came through the other side. The frame was honest. No one pretended it wasn't devastating, but the frame was also finite. The ones still struggling a year later had let the event become an identity. I am someone who survived the flood. Not, I survived a flood. The difference between those two sentences is the difference between a scar and an open wound. There's a smell in old emergency shelters, industrial cleaning fluid over something that can't quite be cleaned, a dampness in the cinder block that no amount of bleach resolves. And the people who described their time in those shelters with the most precise detail, the most temporal specificity, were the ones who had done something counterintuitive. They had let themselves remember it as a chapter, not as the whole book. Survivors who described the hurricane using specific sensory details. The sound of the water coming through the door, the exact color of the sky at 4 in the afternoon, the weight of a wet mattress they dragged to higher ground, showed measurably better outcomes than survivors who described it in abstract terms. Trauma, damage, devastation. The abstract language correlated with diffusion. The specific language correlated with containment. The mind processes what it can locate. When an experience is too large, too diffuse, when it's just catastrophe, just crisis, just disaster, it can't be placed. It becomes everywhere. And everywhere is where chronic activation lives. This is the point where two things need to enter the room together because they don't work separated. The law of vibration and the law of attraction are not independent switches. They operate in sequence, and they operate on this exact terrain. The law of vibration says that everything has a frequency, including your nervous system, including the emotional register you're running in right now as the footage plays. The law of attraction says that the frequency you sustain is what you draw more of toward you. Not as punishment, not as reward, as physics. The uncomfortable implication of those two laws held together is that absorbing news in a state of unlocated dread, where the event has no temporal edges and sits as ambient weight, is not neutral. It's generative, not of the disaster, but of the internal conditions that will shape what you notice, what you interpret as threatening, what you move toward and away from in the hours and days that follow. This is not a reason to stop watching. It is a reason to watch differently. What you're doing when you absorb the Texas footage, the flattened structures, the streets swallowed to its stop signs, the family standing in front of a concrete pad where something stood, is an act of exposure. You are allowing the weight of another person's reality to make contact with your nervous system. That's not weakness. That's what connection costs. The question is not whether you feel it. You feel it. The question is where it lands inside you. Does it land as something that is happening, that you are witnessing, that has a location and time? Or does it settle into the body as something ongoing, something ambient, something that hums beneath every other experience without edges or address? Because if it settles the second way, it stops being news. It becomes weather, your inner weather. And the frequency of that weather is what the law of vibration is measuring. The law of attraction is working from that reading, not from your intentions. You are not a survivor of the Texas storms. You're watching them. That distinction matters. But the same mechanism is operating, and the researchers kept returning to the same architecture. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of edges. The river moves through because the bank holds. The water is real. The current is real. And the bank is also real. The people who came through carried it as something that had happened to them. Past tense, specific, located. They didn't carry it as their frequency. That distinction between an event that altered you and an event that became you is where recovery lies. And it is not coincidentally where the laws are either working for you or against you, depending on whether you've given the experience a frame or let it dissolve into everything. The gap between living through something and watching it through a screen is real, but the mechanism doesn't change at the boundary. The riverbank still has to hold. The water still has to pass. And the question of whether you're using the news or whether the news is using you turns out to be the same question the survivors were already answering without knowing they were answering it. The ones who recovered, well, had made themselves the riverbank. That's not a metaphor for detachment. It's a description of how a person stays available to the world without becoming the world's damage. Fully feeling, clearly bounded, frequency intact. That's where the next part of this conversation begins. There's a smell that arrives before the images do. Something like dust and metal, faint through the window. The particular quality of air before a storm that is not arriving but has already passed somewhere else. You're at a table. The coffee in the cup beside the keyboard has been cold for 20 minutes. On the screen, rooftops, brown water to the eave line. A man in a flat-bottom boat navigating what used to be a county road in Kerr County, Texas. You're watching this in a room that is dry and still. Your jaw is set. You do not realize it until you try to swallow. That tightness, that is not weakness, and it is not a malfunction. It is your interior life surfacing the way sediment rises from the bottom of a river after a storm. Not voluntarily, not dramatically, just as a fact of physics. The question this chapter has been building toward is not what you felt. It is what that feeling was already sitting inside of, because the footage arrived into something. A field, a register that was already running before you opened the browser, before you made the coffee, before the morning started. The flood did not create what you felt. It revealed what was already there. Two people watched the same aerial shot. Cattle pressed against a fence line. A child's inflatable pool turning slowly in the current near a collapsed porch. One of them closes the laptop and moves on. The other carries the image into the afternoon, jaw still set, chest slightly compressed, sleep later that night edged with something unresolved. The footage was identical. What it dropped into was not. The nervous system is not a screen. It is a tuning instrument. Decades of waking up bracing, of absorbing news architected to activate, of carrying loss that never fully metabolized. All of that sets a register. Not your identity, your current operating condition. And that condition does not passively receive events. It participates in them. Researchers at UCSF Center for Health and Community found that individuals whose nervous systems had learned to treat ambiguity as danger showed not only higher inflammatory markers over time, but measurably different social environments. The threats they encountered were real. They were not imagining. But the appraisal system had been sensitized past the point of accuracy. Neutral information was arriving as danger. The external world had, in a very real biological sense, aligned with the internal one. Not because reality bent to thought, but because a body tuned to threat moves through the world differently, notices differently, and over months and years, ends up somewhere different. That is not a spiritual claim. It is what the data describes. And none of it is blame. The man who cannot watch flood footage without something primal moving through his chest did not engineer that sensitivity. Life assembled it. Losses that were never witnessed properly assembled it. Years of sitting with a low-grade current of dread, the kind that never fully discharges, assembled it. The nervous system learned what it learned because at some point the learning was necessary. This is simply where it left you. The problem is not the original calibration, is that a baseline, unlike a single spike of fear, compounds. The body cannot distinguish between a hardship and the sustained anticipation of one. The UCSF data reflects what older clinical literature called the cost of chronic bracing. The HPA axis does not care whether the threat is in the room or in the feed. What it responds to is duration. And if the signal has been running long enough, it becomes the floor the body defends. Here is where the cold coffee becomes something else. In the minutes after you absorb something difficult, the footage, the headline, the number at the bottom of the chart. Researchers at Stanford's Psychophysiology Laboratory have been studying what they call a window of increased plasticity. The event has shaken something loose. The rigid pattern of response has not yet closed back around itself. In that window, which is brief and does not announce itself, deliberate input has leverage that it does not have at other moments. Not to suppress what was felt. Suppression is expensive and accomplishes nothing durable. But to introduce a different signal before the old pattern reseals. The texture of the arm of the chair under the hand. The specific weight of the floor through the soles of the feet. A breath held 2 counts longer than feels natural. Something with a smell, coffee, even cold coffee, even that. Something that returns the body to a surface it can actually touch before the abstraction of the footage closes back around it and becomes weather. That is recalibration, not as a protocol, as a moment-to-moment act that uses the news, uses the weight of real events, which are not metaphor, which are happening to actual people in actual water, as an instrument of your own measurement. You do not need calm circumstances to find your baseline. You need sufficient disruption to see clearly where the baseline is. The flood is diagnostic, not because the disaster is symbolic, but because your response to it carries information about the field it arrived into that is too precise to ignore. The older psychophysiology literature has a word that almost never surfaces in popular writing about stress. Allostasis, not homeostasis, the body returning to the same point, but allostasis, the body setting a new point, a new defended normal. The HPA axis calibrates to whatever it is chronically exposed to, sit for years in sustained low-grade threat, and the body will set that as the baseline it protects, will begin to read neutral events as dangerous because the threshold has genuinely shifted, not metaphorically, structurally. The inverse is documented with equal consistency. A 2022 paper in Frontiers in Psychology, examining adults specifically over 50, found that deliberate, repeated exposure to states of coherence and agency lowers the set point over time. Threat appraisal becomes more accurate, less anticipatory. The same footage watched from a recalibrated baseline leaves a different residue in the body. Not because the footage changed, because the field it arrived into had been maintained differently, incrementally, through choices that were small enough to seem insufficient but cumulative enough to shift what the body defends. This is the work the chapter is pointing at. Not detachment, not optimism as a practice of will. The work of sitting with the cold coffee, in the room with the footage still somewhere behind your eyes, and asking with clear attention and no self-judgment. What is the temperature of the field this landed in? And then, in the window before it closes, pressing one hand flat on the table, finding the floor, letting the smell of something actual arrive. The field is adjustable. That is not sentiment. That is the conclusion of the elasticist literature, and it is what is available to anyone who has lived long enough to understand that the world did not get easier. They simply got more precise about where they were standing inside it, and what they chose to do in the narrow moment before the pattern sealed again. Two people are sitting across from each other in a room neither of them designed. That is how most difficult conversations begin. You did not choose the architecture of this moment. The Texas flooding did not consult you before it arrived. The smoke over the Northeast did not ask permission before it turned afternoon into something that smelled like the inside of a century-old chimney. You were handed a room, and you walked in anyway. That is not a small thing. There's a particular quality to the air in here now that was not present at the beginning of this video. Not lighter. Lighter would be a lie. And you would have already sensed the lie the way you sense a false note in a piece of music you know well. Not because you can name the note, but because something in the body contracts slightly at the wrongness of it. The Texas rancher is still assessing losses this week. The air quality monitors in Philadelphia and New York are still tracking particulate count. The climate scientists who have been saying something for years and watching arrive anyway are still sitting with that particular frustration. The frustration of accuracy without relief. None of that softened. The world did not renegotiate its terms while you were watching. What changed is the quality of your contact with it. When the images from Houston arrived at the beginning of this hour, the highway interchange submerged to the railing. The footage of cattle ranches underwater, they were landing in you the way emergency alerts land. Sharp, intrusive, coded red. The body does not distinguish between a threat 40 miles away and a threat in the room. It responds to both the same way. Pulls blood toward the limbs. Shortens the breath. Raises the shoulders almost imperceptibly. The way clouds thicken before rain. You rarely notice it happening. Only after when the storm has already been overhead for an hour. You have been here for that hour. You went the direction most people don't. Most people spend 45 seconds with a headline and carry the residue for 3 days, the body still half-braced, still waiting for the impact that already arrived. You stayed. You let the weight of the Texas flooding come into full focus. The families who drove out with children and documents and nothing else. The elderly residents who couldn't drive out at all. The Northeast smoke in its full strangeness. That amber gray that turned midday into a photograph from another century. The wrongness of it. The masks returning. The air becoming something you had to negotiate with. You let those things be as heavy as they actually are. And something happened to your breathing while you were doing that. Not because you were instructed to breathe differently, because sustained, honest attention to a difficult thing, without catastrophizing it, without minimizing it, changes the respiratory pattern on its own terms. The inhale lengthens first, then the exhale follows. The body, when it feels genuinely accompanied through something difficult, stops bracing for what it believes it will have to carry alone. Here is what the body has been carrying that you stopped noticing. A contraction in the secondary respiratory muscles, across the upper chest, across the back of the shoulders. Armor. You have been wearing it every morning when the news arrives for long enough that it became background noise. The refrigerator hum, the highway in the distance, the tightening when the phone screen lights up with another headline about another American city underwater or under smoke. Right now, that contraction is less than it was when this video began. That is the actual measurement, not mood, not outlook. A physiological shift in how the body is standing inside the same world. Now, because you have earned this, because the emotional ground is prepared and not before, there are two things worth naming directly. The first is this: the body responds to repeated experience. A nervous system that has moved through a difficult thing once knows it can move through it again. Not because the next difficult thing will be smaller, but because the capacity to process has been used and therefore confirmed. The law of vibration is not mysticism. It is the observation that the state you are in when you encounter something determines what that encounter generates in you. A body that is braced registers threat and adds it to existing threat. A body that has been through the processing registers the same event and begins working with it. These are different outputs from the same input. You can learn to choose the state you bring to the encounter. Not by denial, by practice. The second, that practice has a shape. The law of attraction in its useful form is not about wishing outcomes into existence. It is the recognition that where you direct sustained attention, with honesty, without flinching, is where your capacity grows. You spend an hour here, not skimming, not bracing and clicking away. You directed attention toward a difficult thing and held it. That is the mechanism, not magic, not optimization. Attention held long enough to move through to the other side. The smoke smell, that amber, ancient smell that does not belong to summer and yet arrived in the middle of one, even that sits differently in you now, is still a wrong thing. But it is a witnessed wrong thing, given its full weight and its full human cost. And something about that witnessing, the refusal to look away, combined with the refusal to be consumed, changes the register of how it lives in the body. Not resolution, not closure, something more honest than either. The way the air gets after a storm has fully passed. Not warm yet, not easy, but clean in a way that only comes from the storm having actually moved through. You walked into a room you didn't design. You stayed until the weather changed. That is the whole practice stated plainly. Everything else is just doing it again and finding each time that you already know how. The first morning after a flood, the smell is not what people expect. Not water. Mud, yes, but underneath it's something older. Saturated wood, disturbed sediment, the particular note of things that were sealed for decades and are now open to the air. People who have been through it describe it as the smell of the inside of a wall. A smell that should not exist outside, now everywhere. Hold that. We looked at the water rising in Kerr County. We looked at the smoke moving east across the mid-Atlantic. The way it turned the afternoon a color that commuters noticed but could not name. A bruised amber flat, without the warmth of an ordinary late sun. We looked at what sustained cortisol load does inside a body that has been alive for 50 or 60 years. The inflammatory cascades that take longer to resolve, the sleep architecture that fractures and rebuilds more slowly than it did in the previous decade. We reported the physiological specifics because they are true and because you're better served by true things than by smooth ones. And something else was happening at the same time. The breath changed. The nervous system, which had been bracing against the information, began to locate something steadier than bracing. Not because the information got lighter, but because the body found a different relationship to receiving it. That difference is not rhetorical. It has a mechanism, The law of vibration holds that everything in a physical system, including the nervous system, including the tissue that holds memory and threat response, is in a state of frequency. Sustained attention to catastrophe without resolution is itself a frequency, and it entrains. The body begins to run at the pitch of the alarm. The law of attraction, which operates at the level of that same frequency, means that what you bring to the next piece of information is already set before the information arrives. You do not read the headline neutral. You read it from inside whatever the last hour built in you. That is what was being worked on tonight, not the events, the frequency at which you receive them. Here is what that feels like in the body when it is being disrupted rather than entrained. A slight warmth that returns to the hands, which had gone cool. A loosening in the jaw you did not notice had tightened. Breath that drops an inch lower in the chest without being instructed to. These are not metaphors. They are measurable shifts in autonomic state, and they change what the next piece of news does when it lands. The subscription is not a gesture toward this channel. It is a decision about frequency, your own. It is the choice that means the next time the world sends something heavy through, you have a place to bring it where the reporting is complete and unflinching, and the processing does not stop at the peak of the cortisol curve and leave you there. Most delivery does. The platform spikes the attention, harvests it, and moves to the next item. The residue stays in the tissue. A tightness by Wednesday that was not there Monday. A trace in the chest from a headline about flooding in a county you have never driven through. A trace you cannot name and cannot quite clear. We have been working on that trace for the last hour. The events remain what they are. The Texas floods were catastrophic. The smoke was real. The particulate matter data on aging lung tissue is not in dispute. None of that is softened here, and none of it will be. What shifts is the frequency at which you receive it, and that frequency is trainable. Every session, it becomes slightly more durable. Not numb, durable. There is a texture difference between those two states that the body knows even when language does not have a precise word for it. Numbness is absence. Durability is presence that holds. The button is there and it costs nothing. What it does is ensure that next flood, next smoke event, next geopolitical rupture that arrives with that particular low-frequency dread you feel before you have even finished the first paragraph. You come here first before the residue has time to settle and harden into something harder to move. There is one more thing before the close. You remember the image that opened this hour. Water pressing against a door in Kerr County. Not with rage, not with intention, simply with the indifferent logic of pressure finding its path. The smell of the sediment we started with, the bruised amber sky over the commuters, and that door, the force accumulating against it, water moving with the absolute calm of something that does not know is frightening. You receive that image at the start in one physiological state. You are receiving it now in another. That is not a small difference. That is the entire argument. The event did not change. The image did not change. Your frequency did. And frequency is what determines whether information passes through you or lodges. Whether it becomes data you can act on or residue that acts on you. The final chapter starts from exactly that point. Do not let the state you are in right now dissipate before we get there. The door is underwater now. That is where we began. Kerr County, July. The Guadalupe rising faster than anyone's legs could carry them. The brown water pressing against the frame of a door that was supposed to open the other way. We began there because that image does something to the chest that a statistic cannot. Because the body of a person who has been alive 45, 50, 60 years has learned to read water, has learned what it means when the ordinary things start moving. We promised you something at the start of this, not a solution, not a protocol. We promised that by the time you reach this moment, that image would look different to you. Not smaller, not less real, different. It does, doesn't it? Not because the water went away. It didn't. The Guadalupe flooded. The smoke hung over Philadelphia for 4 days, the color of old copper. The dermatologist in Houston saw a 9-year-old with smoke-related conjunctivitis and wrote it in a chart that no one will read twice. Those things happened. They are still happening. The world did not rearrange itself while you were watching, but something in the room where you were sitting rearranged itself. The temperature of how you hold this, that shifted, and that is not a small thing. That may be the only thing, in the end, that is entirely yours. There is a concept that older mariner cultures used, not romantic myth, actual navigational practice, called wayfinding by the body. The Polynesian navigators who crossed open Pacific without instruments were trained from childhood to feel the swell of the ocean through the hull of the canoe, through the floor of the boat, through the bones of the pelvis. They read wave direction not with the eyes, but with the hips, with the belly, with a quality of attention that modern neurologists would now call interoceptive accuracy. The measured ability to know what the body is sensing before the thinking mind processes it. They were not predicting the ocean. They were reading it as it arrived. And in reading it, they knew which way was land. That is what 60 years of living actually builds if you let it. Not immunity to the storm. Not the ability to stop the water. The ability to read its direction while you're standing in it. The work this video asked of your nervous system was not comfortable. We reported what happened in the hill country honestly, without softening the number of the dead or the speed of the rise. We sat inside the epidemiology of what wildfire smoke does to a cardiovascular system that has been running for 5 decades. The particulate matter smaller than a human hair crossing the alveolar wall, the vagal tone dropping, the inflammatory cascade that takes weeks to quiet. We did not skip past that. We reported it because the truth of it deserves to be reported, and because a person who has been allowed to fully receive a hard thing is different physiologically, neurologically, from a person who has been handed a distraction. The body is looking for completion. It is looking for the moment when the wave finishes moving through. When you interrupt that, when you cut away from a hard image before it resolves, the wave keeps moving. It just moves somewhere you can't see it. The signal doesn't dissolve, it migrates. And most people carry it around for years like that, a low, unresolved frequency underneath everything. The permanent low-grade sensation that the water is always rising and they're always almost too slow. That is the work we did together tonight. You allowed the flood to be a flood. You allowed the smoke to be smoke. You did not look away, and you did not collapse into it. You moved through the shape of the thing all the way to the other side of it. And the other side of it is here, this room, this hour, you're breathing, which is likely slowed without you asking it to. There's a quality of attention that becomes available after that kind of completion. Something settles. The jaw unclenches by a millimeter. The air from the heating vent smells faintly of dust and something older underneath it. wood, maybe, or the particular scent of a house that has stood in one place long enough to accumulate its own memory. The stillness after difficulty is a different stillness than the stillness before it. Anyone who has ever sat at the end of a long, honest conversation with someone they trust knows the distinction. It is not emptiness. It is something more like room. The state you sustain is the lens through which the next event arrives. That completion you just moved through, that is not passive. It is a signal the nervous system sends forward into the next hour, the next morning, the next piece of news. What holds the frequency of interrupted dread attracts more of itself, more incompletion, more of the sense that the emergency is always 1 second ahead of you. What completes the arc, what actually lands, opens ground instead of narrowing it. That is not a spiritual claim. That is pattern recognition, and you just changed the pattern. The goal we are leaving you with is not calm. The goal is something more like accuracy, an accurate relationship with what is real, including its weight, including its scale, including the genuine grief that belongs to genuine loss. Grief is not the problem. Unfinished grief is the problem. What we're leaving you with is the difference between being moved by the water and being moved by it in a direction, between reacting and reading. The people who lose themselves in emergencies are rarely the ones who acknowledge the emergency most clearly. They are the ones who were caught inside a state of chronic, unresolved, anticipatory fear before the emergency arrived, so that when the real thing came, it confirmed a dread that had already been running for years. The people who move in a flood are often the ones who have developed, through whatever means and in whatever proportion they found it, a practiced relationship with difficulty. Not absence of fear, a practiced relationship with it. The navigator does not pretend the open ocean is a lake. He reads the swell with his body, accurately, and then he sets the course. The swell is information. The storm is information. All of it is real. All of it is heavy. None of it is the final word on what you are capable of navigating. The session is over. You are back in the world. It is the same world. You're not.